just to introduce, Ed Cutrell he works with Microsoft Research. He was in India for several years. A couple of years ago, he moved back to the US. He's working from there, but he keeps coming back to India. He was mentioning he was in India only 2 days ago, so he's still on India time in that time. So all over to you, Ed, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Okay, great. I thought I would just tell you a little bit about myself first before we get going. As Anirudh just mentioned, I spent probably 7 years or so in India managing the Technology for Emerging Markets group. Can you all hear me okay first?
Yes,
yes. Sure. Good. So I was managing this group that you probably all know about that does a lot of work with technology for international and global development of various sorts. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time on were problems in India, both in rural and in urban India, but particularly looking at more sort of marginalized folks who don't use a lot of technology, or places where technology could clearly benefit sort of the situation that folks were in, sort of on their behalf, even if they're not direct consumers of the tech themselves. And so that was a lot of our focus. So what I thought I would do today is tell you all about a little story that happened with some tech that we had a great idea for some tech and we wanted to deploy it, but we wanted to do some realistic comparisons between what our ideas were and what another group was trying to work on, with a very different sort of notion in their design space. And so basically this is a little story that I'm going to tell you about comparing these things together, and how sort of your initial impressions aren't necessarily the whole story. So you need to pay attention a little bit broader. So I'm going to go ahead and try to share the screen at this point. All right. So this work, first off, let me say, is in collaboration with a lot of other people. And so, you know, the Indrani Meditis was one of the main researchers that I was working with on this. But there were actually a number of other folks involved as well. And they're all down there at the bottom. There's like Rohit Jain, Anush Tiwari, Mohini Bhavsar, Michael Mateki Fisher, and then we had another bit of it along with some other folks. But it was actually a much larger team. So let's get started. So first off, I want to situate where we were looking. So we were focused here on the Kanva district of Madhya Pradesh. So this is a very remote area, as many of you may know. It's far away from almost any large city, and it's very rural as well. And it's extremely poor. And there were a number of problems here, and one of them is child malnutrition. The group we were working with is called the Real Medicine Foundation. They're RMF. They're an NGO that helps to work with child malnutrition in particular as sort of interventions. And so we started partnering with them to try to see if there were ways in which some information technology could improve a lot of their endeavor for combating child malnutrition. It seemed like a good idea. So let me give you some background about what they do. So you have these folks that are called community nutrition educators, and these are folks that are directly employed by RMF, by the NGO. These folks, these are women, and they go from village to village, and they look at levels of malnutrition among the kids. And they use these little tape bands, these measurement bands. You can see the woman here wrapping it around the arm of the child. And this gives them something called a MUAC. This is the mid-upper arm circumference. Okay? This measurement is a really good proxy for urgent levels of malnutrition. You might think that that's kind of surprising, that just sort of measuring this little bit of the arm could be so good, but it actually turns out to be a pretty good indicator for severe malnutrition. So what these CNEs do is they go from village to village. They measure these, they take all these measurements of children's arms, And then what they do is they record all this, and if there are any really serious cases of malnutrition, they refer them to the local Anganwadi workers. And then the Anganwadi workers then have to provide various kinds of nutritional supplementation to get the kids, hopefully, back up to weight a bit. And the government provides a lot of the malnutrition, the sort of nutrient stuff that they provide them. But this is basically the way it works, is that the RMF acts as sort of an indicator to figure out what children ought to be getting this stuff. They refer it to the Anganwadi workers, and then the Anganwadi workers do the intervention. All right. So there were a few problems with the system that they were using. Okay, so they had a completely paper-based system. As many of you know, this is very common. And there were a few issues with it. First off is that the information that RMF got was fairly low granularity. So in other words, what would happen is that the various CNEs would take individual details about the children that they had looked at in a given village, and then they would roll all that up into daily counts that then they would provide back to RMF. So RMF didn't really know anything about individual patients and their history. And then there was quite a bit of data loss as well in that. Another problem with this system is you had really high temporal lag. So there would be basically months between when the CNE would record the information and when the central office would actually get this information from them. That wasn't always critical, but it was a really big problem for detecting trends. By the time a trend even existed, you're already like weeks and weeks away from what was happening. The other problem is that there was a really high opportunity for error when you were transcribing all this stuff. When we were doing the analysis on these books, we were finding almost 35% error rate in the transcriptions. Another problem here, as you can see, is that it was called one-way data, and what that means is that the CNEs would provide data, the data would go up to RMF, and it might as well have just been going down a black hole. The CNEs had no idea what happened to this information. So there was no good feedback for them. Were they doing a good job? Was this the information they needed to do? And there was really no urgency because from their perspective, they send this stuff off and it just disappears in the black hole of the bosses. And then finally, this was tedious to do, because the CNEs had to go through these books of details that they had written, transcribe all the information to these worksheets that then would go up to RMF, and so it would take a long time to even transcribe the data from the 60 CNEs into the main system. All right, so that's sort of the background of some of the problems that we had. Around this time, we had been working on a project that used this thing called the Milpa tablet device. And you can see a picture of it here. We were using this at the time in Orissa and in the Northeast, looking at cases of groups of women that were monitoring their funds. So these would be like chit funds or other kinds of group lending kinds of things for rural women's groups. And we had created this system that sort of would help replace what they were doing. And it used this device, you can see in the bottom left here, that allowed for natural handwriting of numbers on paper. And then the system, this little tablet, the pen that you would write with was actually an active pen. And so the tablet would do transduction of what we had from the paper. And we could automatically digitize the entries that the women would write on this little tablet into electronic format. And then we could do things like audio reports back to the women. And this was an important thing for this circumstance because many of the women were non-literate. And so if you're talking to them about the accounts and their balances, it was really useful for them to actually hear that. So we had this device. We really liked it. We had a lot of evidence that it was very useful in making it very easy to move from a paper-based system into an electronic system because the women could continue to use just the simple paper that they were used to, but we would automatically get this digital transduction. We thought this would be a great type of a device to try to use in the case of RMF now, where they had a very similar kind of situation, where they were doing a bunch of data entry on tablets with their paper that then we could just sort of automatically transcribe. So we built a system for that. All right, so essentially what we did was we took the existing MILPA system and then we adapted it for the RMF case. Now, about the same time, one of a group that we often work with, there's a company based out of Boston that's called ComCare. They had a solution that they were talking to a number of NGOs about that was based on inexpensive Nokia phones. And it was a purely phone-based solution rather than this tablet. And the NGO we were working with, RMF, was really interested in trying both of these out to see what was going to work best for them. And so this gave us a really nice opportunity to do a careful study of side-by-side deployments of two different IT interventions that were really trying to focus on the same thing. And we were able to do this in a very neat fashion, where we had groups of women in nearby districts doing one system, and then in the other district, another system. And they would never see each other, so there was no crosstalk between the two. But we'd be able to hopefully be able to get a pretty good comparison between the phone-based solution and our text-based solution. All right, so that's the background. This was a 3-month situation with about 20 health workers overall. All right. In the digital slate, so just to remind you of what we're really testing here, in the digital slate version, we have a very natural interaction. This is pen and paper. It's using a system that the people already use regularly. This is natural Hindi that they're writing in and numbers. It's also a special purpose device. So this is a somewhat unique and novel kind of device that they would have to manage. Now, the comparison was this phone solution. And the thing about the phone solution was it was a very common phone. And so this is something that most of the workers were very familiar with. It was fairly inexpensive. But because it's a traditional kind of phone interaction, it was actually complex quite a bit. It used triple tap Hindi text entry, which if any of you have used this, you know that that's actually fairly tedious to use. And if you're not an expert at it, it's actually kind of hard to learn. So this is the comparison. So this is the overview of what the deployment was really about. It was 3 months. We had 20 CNEs. All of the CNEs spoke at least 2 languages. They spoke Hindi plus some local tribal language. That would be either Korku or Nimadi. They all had a mobile at home. So they were familiar with mobiles, at least peripherally. Only 3 of the 20 had their own phone. And only 1 of all 20 had ever sent or received an SMS. So they were fairly naive users. They were not power users by any stretch of phones at all. Now, for both systems, and as I said, we deployed sort of side by side. We had the system with the MILPA device, and we had the system with the phones. And for each of them, we did 1-day training sessions with the 10 CNEs. So we had the 10 CNEs, and then we had 1 district coordinator, and then a regional coordinator of RMF that was associated with each device. We had sort of verbal informed consent. This was a study after all, and we needed to be very careful about that. And the data that we recorded from all this were face-to-face interviews. We did a lot of analysis of all the paper forms that we got back, and an analysis of the CommCare data that we retrieved. All right, so that's actually the background of the actual study. So, what do we find? Well, first off, let's look at latency. Now, I mentioned earlier that for the paper, the traditional kind of thing that we were using before, we were expecting about a month and a half for only aggregated village-wise data. For the CommCare system, the phone system, we had around 8-hour turnaround for all the data. So we've obviously got a massive bump here. The central office at CommCare was typically receiving patient-wise individual data, as well as all the roll-up data, usually within 8 hours of recording. Data completeness. Well, for the original paper version, we were looking at 67% of the daily village visits were actually filled out. And when we went to the CommCare system, we're looking at 84%. So another significant bump in how much data you actually got back. And then finally, one of the things we were looking at was quality of the data. And basically with CommCare, we dropped from 10% error rate to 0. And that's, of course, assuming that there are no error rate at the point of entry, which we can't tell. So if somebody typed in the wrong number, in the village, we wouldn't know that. But at least we know that anything that they recorded was actually what we were getting. And this is different from with the original paper where everything had to be transcribed. And so you would get this level of errors at that point. Now, so that was for CommCare data. Now let's look instead at the CommCare for the digital slate. Basically, we got no data at all. And so we couldn't say anything about how effective it was. Now let's dig a little deeper. Why did that happen? Well, first off, there were significant issues associated with infrastructure. So this is a very remote area, and there were many power outages, often for up to 20 hours a day. And of course, really widely varying voltage. Now this shouldn't be news to most folks that have been into rural India, but one of the really lovely things about the Nokia phones is that they charge very fast. And so the workers would plug them in, and even if they only got a few hours of electricity overnight, they would be charged up. Very frequently, our digital slates would not be even charged because they were a really slow charging device, and so it would take up to 6 hours to charge. So this was a real problem in that various people would take phones into the field with them, or not phones, but the slates into the field, and they would be depleted by the time they were done. A second issue with the infrastructure is that CommCare had a nice little feature in their app on the phone, which was called smart connectivity. And basically, it would ping and look for any kind of 2G data whenever it might appear. And so as the women would move from village to village, going over hills into other areas that were maybe clear of trees, they might get some signal. Whenever the device noticed there was signal, it would send up data. So that turned out to be fairly important. And this was different from the slates, which actually required a single point in order to send the data back. There's another issue which we weren't expecting. And it's basically that the device robustness turned into a real issue. This was right around monsoon. And it was really awkward to transport this thing. The women would wrap them up into big bits of plastic. They were very worried about them getting wet. The Nokia phones were very easy to keep protected. And of course, we all know they're quite robust as well. Frequently, they're transporting on bikes, crowded buses, other kinds of things, and they were very worried about that with the odd size of the slate as well. They had to sort of carry it around with them, whereas the phone would just slip into a little bag. There was another issue which turned out to be a problem, which is these Nokia phones, there were lots of local repair people so if the phone broke, they could take it to the repair guy, and he knew what to do. We had a number of cases where when the slates messed up, they tried to take it to their local repair guy. The guy looked at it immediately and said, "I'm not touching that thing. I have no idea what this is." And that obviously was a really big problem for us because it could be weeks before we found out that there was an actual problem with the device, and we could get someone to fix it. There was another thing that was very surprising about the phone, which is nothing about the application itself. And this is that a number of the CNEs use the camera and the voice recording of the phone for trying to hold the Anganwadi workers accountable for the care of the children. Now, as I mentioned, whenever there was a problem with the phone, the whenever there was a problem that they detected for children, then they had to report this to the Anganwadi workers, and the Anganwadi workers then had to provide the actual intervention of the kids. What we heard was that it was often the case that the Anganwadi workers just didn't want to do it. They were busy, they wanted to go hang out someplace else, and they just refused. And a number of CNEs started using the cameras and the microphones to record them saying, "If you're not going to do this, I have a recording here of both of us together saying that this needs to be done." And then they would threaten the Anganwadi workers with this kind of evidence. And so this had nothing to do with the application. It just had to do with secondary uses of the phones. There's another issue that we saw which surprised us very much. Now, when we first deployed on the first day of training between the two groups of people, the groups that had the slate and the groups that had the phone, in general, we thought it was a no-brainer that all of the workers were going to love the slate and hate the phone. Because during the training session, the text entry was so difficult that most of the workers were barely able to get a few words into the phone, very laboriously, clicking through them. By the time we came back after 3 months, they all had it nailed down. And we went into some of the homes and we saw things like this chart you see right here. And basically they were practicing. They would have their kids quiz them on how to enter text with the phone. And they were practicing like crazy with this thing. And we were really curious about this. This is another picture of some books. So these are and these women would create these things themselves. This is stuff that they did on their own without any prompting from anyone else to sort of practice how to do text entry with the triple tap. Why? That was one of our big questions. Well, one of the main reasons is because they really, really liked the phones. So these are some quotes. One of them is, "Comcare's system is very nice. We get better video phones for our work. My husband's phone is black and white. It's a basic handset where you can't watch film videos." So basically they're saying, I got this awesome phone out of it. Why wouldn't I like it? The other quote, "My husband's phone never used to have enough balance for me to even give a missed call to my sister. Now I use a Comcare phone to do that. She's married into a rich family and always has balance to call me back." So again, a lot of the motivation here was about the phone more than anything else. And as we talked to them about the learning to use the text, they were saying, "Oh, well, I have to learn to use this system because if I don't, they're going to take my phone away. And I love this phone, and So maybe if I'm able to use this really effectively, they'll just give me the phone. Now, with the tablet, nothing like that was true. So basically, it was this kind of random odd device that they had to carry around that took a long time to charge, that would sometimes be out of juice, and they couldn't use it for anything else but work. So, here's basically what happened. The slate was incredibly popular at training. After the first few days, the first few days of training, it was clear that the slate was going to win. It was obvious from everyone who was watching the two training sessions, the slate was going to be better than the phones. Now, part of the problem here was that it was never really used unsupervised. So as soon as it started to be used unsupervised, all of the problems associated with it cropped up. There was bad infrastructure, the support wasn't there, and people were worried about it screwing up during the monsoon. Now the phone was really kind of hard to use, but aside from that, across the board, everything improved. We got improved data latency from 45 days to less than 8 hours. The data completeness bumped up by about 20%, and we eliminated all the transcription errors. So, in the case of the slate, as I said, it's specialized. And that's good in some ways because it made it really easy to learn. But it was problematic because it was really, there was nothing else to it. It was this specialized thing. Now, in the case of the phone, the use as a multi-purpose device turned out to trump everything else. So what really people loved about it was that they could use this to call their sister in the neighboring village, or to use it to help even support their job through the use of the phone, the microphone and the camera. So that's basically the end of this general talk. And so I wanted to maybe open up a wider conversation about the way you think about your designs initially. As soon as they hit the real users in the world out there, then what usually happens is that they start finding all the secondary motivations and uses for why the context matters so much for the devices you're trying to deploy. And so in the case of this, what we saw was that even after an initial training session of a solid day of training, and we were convinced that the slate was going to be a much better device, basically after a few days of use, the thing flipped entirely. And by the end of a 3-month deployment, we saw that there was zero information associated with the slate, and the phone had basically become the favored device. So that's basically the story I wanted to tell you. And I think that it's a nice story about also thinking deeply about the context of use of what you're deploying. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we'll have some time for maybe some question and answers for a little bit.
Hi Ed. For the question, I just want to give some of the information that I have from my mother, because she works for integrated child development, rural development services. So these days, what they do is they use WhatsApp to collect the data in this format. So every charge would be recorded along with the attendance of Anganwadi workers which are there, and these will be sent to some clerks. The clerks will modify and moderate the data, and then it will be sent to her, and then she'll make a report out of it. So the question lies in so when we're doing some sort of study, should we consider the fact that number of emergent users will increase over a period of time? The technology will enhance its way, and there'll be other devices coming in future which would be better which would be useful than the current existing, maybe in 2 years or two, because I think the study was done in 2012,
That's right. Well, there's a few things to say. First, there are still many places in India where even 2G service is still very unreliable. And so WhatsApp really doesn't work well, even in those cases. So you still have infrastructural concerns, even if the devices are getting cheaper and cheaper, and they are, absolutely. So, I mean, I would say that first, you are always going to have a very sharp slope of increasing power of devices, increasing quality of infrastructure, and decreasing cost of devices. That's certainly going to be true. But it's also the case that you should never think or never assume, particularly if you're looking at areas in the margins of society, if you can't assume that all of the money or infrastructure is going to be there. Just because it's fairly common in, say, all of the villages maybe around Mumbai, that you'll find pretty good coverage everywhere. And a lot of people have smartphones, and it's fairly inexpensive, and you can get Android, etc., that's going to be true universally. And I can promise you that if you leave India and go to Africa, the cost of data increase dramatically as well. And so you can't assume cheap data either. So on the one hand, yes, you're always going to be, you should be planning and thinking about what is the best hardware and software infrastructures and data infrastructures that you have for managing these kinds of things. But at the same time, it's also very good to be realistic about the space that you actually have, and to actually go to the place where you're working and make sure that your assumptions are validated. I don't know if that was a long-winded answer to your question, but did it kind of get there?
Yes.
Yes. If you can go on this side.
It's all good. So when we
Trying to pull it up. Hi.
Hello, sir.
Hello?
When we look into India, so there are a lot of regional languages. So you have Madhya Pradesh is still fine with Hindi language, but you have mentioned about working with Odisha and Northeast. So there are a lot of people who do not understand or who do not speak Hindi. So can you mention some example of the difficulties faced being used only Hindi language? Or are there any initiatives being coming up or being worked upon for incorporating the regional languages?
Well, there's certainly many folks working on regional languages. Where things get more complicated is in a lot of tribal languages. Like there are some tribal languages like Gondi. Like Gondi doesn't even have a transcribed alphabet or any kind of written version to it. So it's spoken only. Now, there are efforts now being done by a number of groups to try to figure out, can we create such a script for some of these languages? But this is really almost a linguistic problem rather than a technical kind of a problem. And so there's actually sort of a blend of issues and challenges there. Now, if all you're doing is, if you've got a language with a pretty good script associated with it, then there are actually a number of tools that you can use for doing just text entry. And whether that's things like even the stuff that was developed there at IDC with the soft text entry for many of the major languages. Now, those can be applied to lots of other languages. And so that works pretty well. Where things get more difficult is in spoken language. So when you're doing speech recognition and natural language recognition with lots of regional languages, the data collection for making high quality, good speech rec in all these languages is very expensive to gather. And so really not very many people have done all the work necessary to collect adequate data to be able to create high quality reco. I mean, even Hindi is only recently getting pretty good. And that's kind of absurd if you think about like the number of people who speak Hindi and how pervasive it is throughout North India. But it's, I would say, only in about the past 4 years or so have companies like Google and even Microsoft a little bit created some decent quality Hindi ASRs. I don't know of any high quality ASRs for tribal languages, and they're not even all that great for, say, some of the northeastern languages and some of the smaller languages. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Right. Anybody else also? Yeah, sure. So, moving more to the left, there are some people. Are you there? Yeah.
So, hi Ed. You've mentioned in the article that, based on the outcomes of the training session, you all improvised the changes on the field so that there's more, the device can be better used. So, what are the changes that has been incorporated on the field?
Well, one of the things that we had to do is this with the actual tablet device? Is that what you mean?
Yes, with the slate device.
Okay. Yeah. So some of the changes were had to do with the way that the thing was launched. Now, the system originally, when we were using it in the office and how we had originally designed it, it was sort of like a thing that you would just tap on the icon for the app itself, and that was just because of sort of the operating system of the tablet provided for this. Now, turned out that when the device would reset or restart, many of the CNEs got very confused by this notion of having to actually launch a special purposed app that was already in his tablet that seemed like it was already special purpose. Like, why would I need to do that? And they would often get themselves into this funny state where the app, the app wouldn't even launch. Like, they would think they were in it, but they weren't. And so some of the changes that we made were making that launch automatically when you would restart the system, so that you would get the app would just start automatically, so that it was a little more like even a phone. When you turn a phone on, the phone is on. It's not like you launch phone. You know, it just turns on and is what it is. There were some other things that had to do with making sure that there's arrangements of the fields. In the tablet, we tried to make the text entry of the book as close to the original as possible, but still be able to provide us the kind of gaps and spacing we needed in order to do decent quality handwriting recognition for the text entry. And there were a lot of tweaks to both the layout of the paper and to the layout of the screen to describe the information, so that they were matched appropriately. And we just made a few of those kinds of changes. They were actually fairly small tweaks. We didn't make major things, but it was clear that, oh, this is a little too cramped. The way a lot of the women write these things is they don't necessarily pay attention to the borders of the little boxes that we had, and they would write over those, and so we had to make the boxes bigger, give it a little more space, so we could get better quality spatialization of the data.
Do you think that this Slate device now, since it does not, it didn't match up to the phone user. So, do you want to, or do you plan to use it in a maybe a different context and do the experiment all over again?
No, I think at this point, it's actually, this refers back to a question 2 questions ago, which is technology has marched on. And there are places where this might work out okay, but in general, the cost associated with having the special purpose device, we can't match the kind of cost reduction you can get with cheap Android phones. And so the general experience is that by now, I think, you're better off just building something on a fairly inexpensive Android device and going from there. So I think at this point, probably we'll just drop the slate and not do any more work with that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please.
So, hi Ed, my name is Harini and I'm a PhD scholar in the Rural Technology Alternatives Center inside IIT Bombay, and some of us in this room are also from that department. So we work in different geographies across India, and malnutrition has now become one of the major areas of focus, not just for the country but also for our center here. And what most of the times happens is that when we make a change in the way the ground level worker has to collect data, because right now everybody's challenge is to get good quality data so you know where the problem lies and then how you take it forward. But whether it is a sector like malnutrition or a problem like malnutrition or any other sector, whatever we introduce, whether it's a change in the process or a new device, there is a big barrier, which is the inability of the ground level workers to sort of accept the change very quickly. And what that does is it sort of, there's a lot of contamination in the data that occurs when you sort of collect it, because some people adapt to the new process or technology very quickly, and the others take their time. So in most of our experiments of this kind, we lose out on the time and the design sort of fails. Eventually, you have a group of people who do it as per the new technology that has been introduced, and then there are some who, because of other social constraints, and they still resort to the older methods. So in your experiment, did you have any behavior change sessions, or did you have any experts speak to these women? Because Madhya Pradesh, as mentioned earlier, is still a largely Hindi-speaking part of the country, but there are other geographies where tribals are, really not sort of up to the expectations as far as using technology is concerned. So can you comment on the behavior aspect of how did you tackle that?
Sure. I mean, it was certainly an issue, and it was one of the major issues for the tablet. Now, one of the things that and this is actually an area of research that I think I would love to continue exploring, and I've had a lot of conversations with Demagi. They're the ones who created the ComCare device for, not device, the software, for ways of increasing uptake and acceptance of tech. One of the things that I thought was so striking about this experiment was the motivations associated with the phone itself. And so one of the things that I think would be really interesting to explore in more detail is these secondary uses of tech as an intrinsic motivator for utilizing the system as part of work. Now, this is something we've actually done some other research on this, and we did actually a whole series of interviews with NGOs across India to try to explore the general acceptance of NGOs for allowing their workers to use the devices that were being deployed for purposes other than only work. And this is a really interesting thing if you think about it, that you're handing out a device to people that are typically very poor, marginalized in various ways. Often the CNEs and other women are also marginalized even among the villages, right? They're very low class typically. They're not very highly respected. And one of the things that giving the device does is it also creates a certain amount of respect associated with it, because they've now been entrusted with this bit of tech. Okay, so that's one nice thing that is helping to do as a motivator. But if that's all you get, is that I've just got this, this thing that I can wave around, well, that's not going to do that much for you. If that thing is also helping you in other ways, and you're concerned that it's going to be taken away from you, and becomes very important in its own right, that can be a strong motivator for using that technology as part of your job. And the thing that we found in this research was that as the software gets better, the quality of the systems get better, so say going from Nokia to Android type systems, the NGOs we talked to became more and more interested in locking down the device so that it couldn't do anything but only what they wanted it to do. So for many NGOs, they were basically, as they got more powerful devices, they were getting more and more restricted in what you could do with them, to where you could only turn the device on and only use the little app for data collection. And there were good reasons for this. I mean, the people would often download lots of movies onto their phone. They would have so much data on, of just like porn and other kinds of stuff on their phones that it wouldn't even, like, they ran out of room for the data that they were trying to collect in the field. That's obviously problematic. There were other concerns they had, which is, well, they're just going to use this irresponsibly and they're going to use up all the data, and we need the data for the work. And so we're just going to prevent them from doing anything else with the phone. And the problem is that sets up an oppositional view for the user, because now the women have this device that they're being told to use. It's different from their normal work environment, and they don't get anything else out of it besides being told what to do. And so this is something that I think we really have to work through. I don't have a silver bullet for this, and we've seen this in many other places, exactly as you describe. But in our case, we didn't have anything special. And this was also actually a tribal area. This was not, they did speak, the workers spoke Hindi plus some of the tribal languages, but this is largely tribal type languages. But, I don't think that it's as much about the fact that a lot of these folks were tribals as it was that there's sort of a way of doing things, and many of the CNEs were frustrated with being able to be effective at what they did. So they would do a lot of things around that to be more effective. Now, maybe our NGO was really special and awesome. I don't know. But it was certainly the case that when we saw a number of these workers using the cameras and the microphones as a way to coerce Anganwadi workers to actually provide food for the kids, that was pretty cool from our perspective, and that suggested a sincere motivation on the part of the workers to do their jobs effectively. So I don't know if I answered your question in full, but you touch on a very serious and difficult issue. But I think that it's possible to be creative about this and look at the larger scope of motivations. Like, what really motivates a person to do their job and to adapt to new demands? And if the only thing that you have to motivate them is this is your job and this is what you're paid to do and you're going to do it this way now, then you're going to get some resistance, especially in something like the case of IT, where one of the things that you're providing with IT is feedback so that your bosses are much more aware, much more quickly of what you're doing and how effective you are, right? Now that's going to be a problem if you maybe want to take, you need to take your kids to school someday or something like that. You're going to do something else. You're not going to go to work that day. Well, if your bosses know that immediately, then that's a problem, right? Whereas before, hey, it's 45 days before they ever find out, who's going to notice? And so that's another issue. And again, this is starting to understand motivations at a deeper level.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else has? Yeah, Deepak.
Hi, so a very nice comparison between ComCare and slate-based system, and ComCare seems to win in all ways.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So my question is, in order to avoid data entry errors from the user side, so the mobile interactions play an important role. I'm not sure whether the errors you showed are only the transcription errors or the errors done by the users while entering the data. So it will be nice if you could please explain how the users interacted with the system, or if you have a video to show, that will be great to understand.
I don't have a video right now. We have, I'm trying to remember if we have screenshots of it. It was fairly primitive, very, very frankly. So first, to answer your question, the error that I was talking about was only paper error, and so that was transcription. That was not point of entry error. The point of entry error we couldn't measure in this study. Now, there's another study that was done a couple of years before with back in like maybe 2011 that was looking at 3 different kinds of data entry. They were looking at text that was then be transcribed like written logs. They were looking at triple tap entry, and they looked at transcription on the phone. So they would just call a call center, narrate the details, and then someone would type in that data. And in general, what we found was that it was almost in the order that I just said them as the quality of the transcription. That when they would put in by hand, that was the worst quality, because there were multiple places in which errors could creep into the system. Whenever they would do direct entry using a mobile, then that was sort of in the middle. They still had errors in that space, but it wasn't quite as bad as writing. The best, by far, was calling up a call center and then having them type it in. One of the interesting things is that in India, that also happens to be probably the most cost-effective for many kinds of things. It depends on what your error tolerance is. So for some kinds of applications, your tolerance for errors is much, much lower than others. And so you're willing to spend a little bit more for that. And we found that in India, for instance, many times you're basically better off paying a call center employee to sit there and just basically type all this stuff in, rather than to deploy a whole bunch of smartphones and then suffer the text entry and all the other errors that were associated with it. So I realized that wasn't exactly your question. Your question is really about the interaction on the actual ComCare device. That device was actually fairly simple. It used soft keys because it was one of those indirect kind of phones. So there was no touch screen. It was indirect. So it had some soft keys up top, and then the text entry was all just triple tap Hindi entry. That's not how you would design it today, because you would almost certainly be doing this on an Android. And so you could use better quality soft text entry, for instance, and better quality direct touch-based interaction that's going to be far more intuitive for anyone. But this was, just 5 years ago. Give me a break.
Thank you.
Yeah, please. You can speak there on the screen.
Yeah, so Ed, I had this one question, that was the Milpa slate like experimental? Because the later you said that it failed because mainly because of there was a lack of power in the rural areas. So before deploying the device, did you think about this thing in the first place?
No, mostly because when we...
Did you think that people will eventually gel along with it as they did with the triple tap keyboard? Did you think people will eventually get used to it in the long run? And you thought it will be a good thing to get them used to something like this in the first place?
So, the two answers to your question. So the first is that, can you move the microphone a little bit? I'm getting an echo.
Yeah, sorry.
Cool. So I would say that there are a couple of answers to your question. So the first is that, yes, it was an experimental device. We had a few thousand of them. This was a device that Microsoft had built for another purpose, and then they basically just gotten rid of them. And so we had about a couple of thousand of these in a warehouse, and we're like, hey, we can use these. So we smuggled a bunch of them into India to try out. The thing is that it would charge much more quickly if you had a constant power. So we weren't aware that the batteries were so sensitive to the quality of power. So even when we were in the district headquarters, the quality of power was much, much better than it was in the very rural areas where these things would often wind up getting plugged in. And so when we tried it out in the field, when we were there, wasn't quite as much the field as where they actually wound up. And so we just didn't realize exactly what a serious problem that was going to be. We did intend for the system to be used more broadly, and our expectation was, well, this is going to work quite well. Now, we had very good luck with the same device in the Northeast with a lot of these other kinds of in the case of finance. Now, it was a different kind of scenario, and it was in an area where evidently they had much better power regulation, so it just wasn't a problem. Also, they weren't using it on a daily basis in a very mobile thing. It was sort of central, it was in the village, and they would pull the thing out during meetings only, which would be every couple of days. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yes, it did. Thanks.
Great.
Hi, Ed. In the back here. I lost his name. Okay, so thank you very much for doing this talk. I just had a couple of wind-up questions of sorts, slightly different from the presentation. So one is, a lot of people look at this kind of work or other kind of work from MSR and from other places, and they get inspired to do something. In fact, there are a lot of requests saying that I would like to take 3 months off and do something. So tell me something that I can do in 3 months. And very often it is difficult to get into some of these areas. So how do you guide people, and what would you tell them? Where would you ask them to begin in doing this HCI40, IXP40 kind of work?
Well, the first thing is that if you're just doing 3 months, that's very hard to do, because 3 months will give you enough time to start making some relationships with people to begin to understand the problem. You can't solve the problem in 3 months. If you could solve it in 3 months, we wouldn't have so many damn problems. So, a lot of these are just very serious issues. And so I would say one of the first things to do, though, is to start making relationships with really good organizations or NGOs or individuals who have contact with these areas, because these folks will do a couple of things for you. One, they're going to have the bridge into the actual problem. So they're going to understand the context much more than you ever will. And so that's going to be able to give you some insight into what are the real problems that are worth tackling, and which ones maybe are, just going to be too big or too trivial. It's almost like that isn't a problem. We get around that just fine. And you say, well, okay then, let's not worry about it. There's another thing that these folks can do for you, which is help steer you around a lot of the political pitfalls. One of the problems with a lot of this kind of work is that you go to try to go into a village or into the field, and you're walking in to a very complex space of political dynamics that you don't understand at all. And often there are reasons why some people would want your intervention or your work to fail, specifically because of these other kinds of political things. And so going in with sort of these kinds of relationships are very, very helpful. So I would say if you've got 3 months, some of the best things you can do is either talk to some people that already have these relationships built up and try to leverage those and go out and hang out with these folks. Or try to find some of these folks and then just go and visit them. In almost every case, I would say parachuting into a place for a couple of days and thinking you have any clue what's going on there is a terrible idea. You're going to fail. You're just going to fail. And many of the really successful projects that we've had have really come from people going and embedding themselves in an area for a very significant amount of time. Whether it's in the slums in in Bangalore, where we go and we just hang out with people for weeks. We're going there every couple of days and we're talking to people and just trying to understand what's going on. And often you start to really clue in on, these are actually the problems that are interesting and that tech might actually be able to do something about. And the other ones, let's just throw them away or put them on a shelf for a little while. But you really need that kind of deep context. And so I would say, if you've got 3 months, first, leverage whatever interactions with organizations or people that have those connections already. Second, don't go in expecting you're going to understand anything in just a few days. And third, be patient about trying to understand what the problems are, because those things will come up slowly and they'll bite you, and when they bite you, then it's awesome because you've got something real. But it takes some time.
Yeah. Okay, and one last question. So you've been in this field for a very, very long time, and you've seen it evolve particularly over the last 10 years very closely. In the next 10 years, this stuff got to become mainstream eventually. I mean, it has to stop staying experimental or research oriented and a lot more. But how do we see, or do you see that transition happening anytime soon, and how do you see that panning out?
So I disagree with your assertion. I think that research is always looking at where things are going to be. And the thing that's deployed in the field is just constantly following that. And so it's just a process of the research is sort of laying the pavement down, and then the traffic starts to follow that afterwards. And so, it is certainly the case that...
How do you How do you see this pan out over the next few years then?
So I think one of the things is, first off, I think that one of the things that is inevitable is that the infrastructure for communication, wireless communications in particular, is going to be, as it becomes more and more stable and pervasive and higher bandwidth, that's going to really revolutionize how a lot of these things work. Aadhaar depends on it utterly, right? And so there's really a huge amount of motivation, certainly in India, for making this stuff be there. And that makes a lot of these difficulties that we had back, 8 years ago go away because the infrastructure is supporting it now. And so you can do a lot more stuff at low cost. Now that said, I think that there is going to there will always be people that are poor. And it is always going to be the case that organizations and government and other people will need to be trying to serve them with as few resources as possible. And so this notion of sort of frugal innovation or very cost-real kinds of tech exploration will continue to be critical. And it's going to be stuff that the big tech companies don't care about. It's the stuff that, that really this is where universities and research labs and other folks are going to be sort of pointing at, because, Google's not going to care. They just want you online so they can feed you advertising, right? And Microsoft doesn't care because Microsoft just wants to sell you Office, right? And to be doing stuff on Azure. So, the people that this kind of work that can be effective is going to have to continue to be generated by people who just care about it, and that's going to have to be frugal. It's going to have to be very realistic about cost. So I don't know. I hear what you're saying, and that stuff has to transition into the wild, but at the same time, somebody's got to point the way, and that's going to continue to be true for, I think, forever. As we go.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
So I have one question.
Oh, there is one last question here, and then we close.
So hi Ed, thank you for such an informative talk. My question is not related to this talk. So I was just going through the list of the publication, and you have one interesting, that is social media platforms for low-income blind people in India. So can you just put some light on it, please?
Oh man, that's a whole other half-hour talk. So I basically what that came about almost as an accident. We were doing some explorations of just phone-based, IVR-based different ways of thinking about IVR, and one of them was that we said, well, let's actually do some stuff to see if we can support natural IVR with sort of a social media. So people would call in and they would do some talent or something, and people would upvote, downvote, and we were really trying to just understand, is it possible to do, say, Reddit-style upvoting, community-based sorting of information, but with audio only. And when we did this, we suddenly found this very large number of users that were visually impaired, that spontaneously found out about the system and then started spreading it everywhere. And so it was just a really interesting experience of this viral adoption of a system by a group of people, basically because there was this latent demand. I have never had the kind of praise that we heard from users from this. I mean, there were people basically saying, "You're my God. You have revolutionized my life. My nothing will be the same again," because basically these are kids who have been sequestered by their parents. A lot of people, blind children in India, are basically just put in a back room and protected from the world, and they never get to talk to other people. And so this was an opportunity to actually have some social media interaction with other people, and it was all audio. And so that's really what that paper's about. There's much, much more to it, but I'll shut up there. I think I'm already 10 minutes over time for you guys, which you're all very kind and patient.
So thank you very much, and it was really lovely having you, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for getting up early.
Bye.